Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Wednesday study class. And we are in the book of Ruth, chapter 1 and verse 14. Hopefully, you can see that on the screen as I'm sharing it. And we're only going to look at this one verse today. There's just so much packed in here that we're going to bring out. And it's a very familiar verse, and as it goes, they lifted up their voices and wept. And again, Orpha kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. A very classic verse used in many weddings about kissing and cleaving, used in as topics of many sermons in a lot of churches about being faithful and cleaving uh, rather than just kissing and being unfaithful. So it's a verse that many people are familiar with, but there's a couple of neat things in here that we want to look at. Um, First, it starts, what I guess I want to mention first is the idea of weeping, that they wept. Um, was noticing something that a rabbi had mentioned in the Old Testament, for certainly, as he was making reference to, is that every time a person is recorded in the Bible of weeping and having a entering into this deep realm of weeping, God worked in some miraculous way. And they pointed out that the first time that this word that we see here for known as wept was used was with Hagar. Hagar, if you remember, was Abraham's, actually Sarah's nurse or servant that Sarah gave to Abraham to impregnate, and they had a child, Ishmael. And as tensions became too great, Sarah cast out Hagar and the baby Ishmael, and Hagar sat in the wilderness and she wept. And God heard her voice and answered, and she was actually the first one to give God a name of God who sees, Yahweh Roi. And so they followed this pattern through the Bible that where someone wept, it is normally followed by the miraculous, by a miracle from God. Of course, will see that here as we further on through the story of Ruth, but it also reminded me of a classic verse in the New Testament in the book of John. Of course, anybody who goes through Sunday school and has to do Bible memorization will know that the shortest verse in the New Testament is John 11:45 that says Jesus wept. Again, the same word of weeping. And Jesus wept before the notable miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead. And so I just found that pretty fascinating as that continues through here. So, looking at the other part of this verse here was something that would not have been noticed in the English, but the rabbis bring it out is that this first word, as I'm kind of hovering over here with my cursor, is uh, tish and na, which means to be lifted up. And they point out that in verse 9, where that same word is used here, circling around it here, it has an extra letter. This letter Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, kind of corresponding to the letter A in a very generic way, Aleph is here in this word. And if you look, I go back to verse 14, you'll see that the A is not here, that it goes from the shin to the noon. And of course, this caused them to notice. And so I'm going to go to the Jewish book of Ruth that I have. And of course, in yellow here, I highlight it that they noticed that this Aleph, this letter, was missing. And to them, they figured, well, why is that? Why is it the same word? Why does one have an Aleph in it in the middle and another one does not? And so they came up with a theory. Again, this is how the Jewish study mind works and how the Jewish sages have gone through this, is that this Aleph tells them about strength being diminished, as weeping being diminished. And so it indicates that, in one place they wept more strongly, and another place they wept in a different fashion, in a weaker way. And that the spelling of these letters indicates or links to the word to be weak, and so indicates that they wept continuously throughout their conversation with Naomi until even their strength to cry was weakened. Again, very interesting. It takes it further than maybe we will go in Christian teaching, but you wouldn't have noticed this in the English, but in the Hebrew it stands out that the word is spelled differently. And of course, knowing that this is God's word, and that every word, every letter, we want to believe is special and has a special meaning, why wouldn't we be able to investigate this as they did, and come up with a reason for it that satisfies the context of where they're going? So the next part of it we want to look at is this whole idea of kissing and cleaving. Um, in the King James Version, here this word is would be as cleaving. Here it's the word clung. But what's very interesting is this word, the very first time it was used is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, and it's used to describe the relationship between Adam and his wife Eve. And of course, that comes up in every marriage ceremony about the husband shall cleave to his wife and they shall become one flesh. Very interesting that this same word comes up here again in regards to the relationship between Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. So we're going to take a little bit of a look into this because it's just very interesting. And what I noticed is that this word for cleave here is actually more properly translated as adhesive or stickiness. And I found this beautiful topic being taught about here, that we've heard the term cleave. Again, it's an old English term. When the King James Version was written in 1611, it had maybe a different meaning, and one that we don't maybe understand as well. But we, in our modern understanding, always look at it as having become one flesh, had to do with a marital sexual relationship. But in Hebrew culture, this is the word about stickiness, and is actually related more and referenced here in the book of Job, chapter 38, verse 38, about sticky, wet clods of dirt sticking together, or used again in Job about how scales of a fish or a reptile are stuck together. And it's more about sticking to one another rather than a sexual embrace. In fact, they noted that this word is not even found in the book of the Song of Solomon, which, if you read through that, is sometimes very erotic, very much filled with love and relationships. And here's this word that's spoken about in the book of Genesis to describe Adam and Eve's relationship, and it doesn't even show up in the Song of Solomon. So that's where this comes together, that this is more about sticking. It's more about deliberate commitment. And I thought that was really very interesting, and seeing how it has this relationship here, because in the Bible it's used between not just male and female, but it's used between two people of the same sex, as in Ruth and Naomi. It's also used in other areas through the Bible about sticking together and about something being permanent. And so I thought that was really, really neat about that. This word is about glue, is about sticking together. In fact, I was told that over in Israel today, if you went to buy a bottle of Elmer's glue, it would have this same word, Elmer's or whatever their brand is that markets the glue. It would be called the Davak and it's talking about glue. So just kind of interesting. I thought that really helps us to get a good image in our mind about how the relationship was between Ruth and Naomi, and that it was sticking together and not just cleaving in a way that we maybe have been taught in a previous type of study, especially from the book of Genesis. The other thing we're going to notice here is that when this whole episode took place of them parting ways here, that there are no words exchanged. You don't see anything where Orpha says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I love you, blah, 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 but I'm going back," or Ruth says, "No, I'm going to stay no matter what you tell me." Because remember, Naomi had tried to discourage them these three times from following her, and we talked about that in previous lessons. But you don't see any words exchanged. And of course, that catches the notice of the Jewish commentators. And so we're going to take a look at what they had to say here, kind of circling this lower right-hand paragraph. It says that there were no words. And they take this as in understanding that the pain was very intense, and even so much as they try to read into what was Naomi maybe thinking as she saw Orpha, her daughter-in-law, walk back towards her native country of Moab, and knew that this was the last image, they use the word vestige, of her son Chilion was lost to her forever. So again, very interesting, but it fits, and I kind of like that. And then it says, but Ruth, clung, but she remained silent also. And so as we look further, we see that they talk about Ruth's eyes and her refusal to go, and they talk about many different things in this commentary. But then, of course, they um, talk about what we had just mentioned, that three times did Naomi urge Ruth and Orpah to turn back, and they refused to yield. Both of them did up until this point, up until this third time. And then Orpah weakened and returned to her land, but Ruth persisted in her resolve to go with Naomi. Now, something that I had not realized either, but Jewish culture, when the sages point this out, that generations later, there was another interaction between the relatives of Ruth and Naomi. Specifically, they feel that um, Ruth's ancestor obviously was David. We can trace that very, very clearly, but that Orpha had an ancestor also who was Goliath. And I thought that was quite interesting in the Jewish culture that they brought this out, in that these two relatives met together on diametrically opposing teams, of course, and had it out in the battle. And of course, we know the story of David and Goliath and how that all worked out. So again, very, very interesting here. And then the other thing I want to point out too is that this last word here of Ruth clinging or being sticky um, to her, uh, you notice that they don't have a number over this last word. It's the letters Beit and Hey with a comet's vowel underneath, pronounced Ba, with a kind of a hard B sound and a hard H sound. So there's a lot of vocality in this. And they translate it as clung to her. But you'll see that this bait is a preposition. And so when I open up the preposition for the letter B, it says that it means in, which again really kind of opens up a very different kind of thought process here as to what was happening in this relationship. Of course, to make it make sense, or how we would naturally think of this relationship, it just says clung to her, but really in Hebrew it's clung in her. And of course, looking at it from a stickiness point of view of where her heart was. And it, to me, gives an understanding that it was her heart. It was a heart issue. It wasn't just the physical clinging. It wasn't a physical cleaving, but it was two hearts that were knit together, two hearts that were in each other, that this relationship was very much a love and respect and admiration and caring for one another, that no matter what Naomi, what challenge she put before Ruth, no matter what Ruth's obstacles may have been in front of her, there was nothing that was going to separate her because they were stuck together. Their hearts were like-minded, their minds were like-minded. And we even use the term today that, he was really into her or she was into him. You could kind of put that here because the letter bet means he was in. And so, again, very cool to see how some of this fits together here. And we know the story. We know that, Ruth went and followed Naomi, but just to see the groundwork being laid here and to get an understanding of what this relationship was. And again, to the Hebrew mind, a physical relationship is always secondary, even though, we um, a lot of times think that when they talk about the knowing in the Bible and connect it with a sexual euphemism, in a Jewish culture, this knowing has to go through a process of getting to understand one another, and it comes first with the um, learning to love, learning to understand the person before the physical relationship takes place. And that's why it's kind of vague as it translates into English, but to a Hebrew mind, this knowing would be to get to know the person and become intimately involved in a way that's more vocal and more of understanding uh, before you ever enter into that physical side of the relationship. And so, while that's sometimes difficult to separate in English, it's very clear to them in Hebrew and very much understood that the relationship has to be in place before the physical activity is acted upon. And so I think we see that very closely brought out here with the sticking in to Ruth of Naomi. So I hope you enjoyed that. Again, very cool that we have this ability to unpack these words and do this study. And the Hebrew language just so enriches it in a level for me that I never knew was possible. And I hope you're enjoying that too. So God bless you all. Thanks for being a part of this study and look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.